Доброго ранку, я думаю, будемо потрохи починати. Прошу вибачення за затримку. У нас сучасні інформаційні технології, у нас буде пряма трансляція, тому так, починаємо, щоб пряма трансляція, вона почалася якраз, коли задача закінчилася. У нас робоча мова семінару англійська, тому я теж в наступному слові перейду на англійську. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are welcoming you in the Central Bank of Ukraine. Today we have a third research seminar in our new research series, which were inaugurated earlier this year by Alexei Krivtsov from Bank of Canada. Then we had a seminar of our German colleagues, and today I'm proud to present Yury Городніченко, the associate professor of economics in the University of California, Berkeley, who will present today his based on the evidence. A lot of people in this audience definitely know about him, although he's a rather rare guest in Ukraine, but in the last few years, I would say he's coming more often, because as you might also know, Yury is a co-founder of the Vox Ukraine initiative. But apart from that, he has a very strong academic background. He's a graduate of Kyiv Mogil Academy and then ERC program, which is now Kyiv School of Economics. Then he got his PhD from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, and he's working now for quite a lot of years already, getting tenure in the University of California, Berkeley. Yury is a specialist in macroeconomics and international macroeconomics. I'm really proud that he's helping the National Bank of Ukraine quite a lot now. First of all, I'm extremely grateful to him that he was an author of one of the articles in the NBU Vestnik. It's not the first issue of NBU Vestnik, it's the first issue of new NBU Vestnik, which was published in late September. We really appreciate it, and we are very much feeling his support in all respects and so on. We are now, so far, not so, let's say, yet, it's not like official information, but we are still working in that direction, that we are thinking about organizing NBU annual conference next year. And here, given the high reputation of Yury in international academic circles, we are very much drawing on that reputation, inviting very strong people from academic and policy community all over the world. So I will just stop here to leave more time for Yury presentation and discussion. Yury, the floor is yours, and welcome to the Central Bank. Really appreciate it, as I said.
Thanks very much for this very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I've actually never been to the National Bank of Ukraine. This is my first time, and I'm very impressed with the infrastructure and the people, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to help the NBU in any capacity I can. Now, this paper is joined with Satan Kumar, Olivier Courbion, and Hassan Afrouzi, and this paper is motivated by a very simple sort of observation. We know in modern central banking that anchoring inflation expectations is an extremely important concept, right? So, we have to manage somehow expectations and make sure that people believe that inflation is going to be 2%, 3%, 5%. And the reason why it's important is because many people perceive that many crises that happened before in the United States and in other countries were because of this unanchored inflation expectations. Why do we have high inflation? It's because people expect high inflation. Why do they expect high inflation? Because there is high inflation. And so you can easily get into this vicious circle. And one way to break this vicious circle is to somehow manage expectations, convince people that this is not going to happen. You're going to have low and stable inflation. Okay. Now, in more recent times, the management of inflation expectations got a new policy role. Basically, the idea here is that by convincing people that something is going to happen in the future, you can influence economic outcomes now, right? So, for example, in the context of the zero lower bound, which is very important for many developed countries, you can't lower interest rates any further, but you want to stimulate the economy. What do? You try to convince people that you're going to do something in the future so that you anchor these expectations, but you have an economic outcome today, okay? This quote from Ben Bernanke, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve System, is a very nice summary of what he was saying. what was the view of the Fed and other central banks at the time? Basically, anchoring expectations is an extremely important thing. You should always strive to achieve something like this. Now, as I said, with the ascent of the zero lower bound, when you run basically out of ammunition, you can't stimulate the economy any further, you are desperate for new tools to stimulate the economy. And this management of expectations is an extremely important tool here. The idea here is that the real interest rate affects consumption and investment choices of private agents in the economy. The normal tool of the central bank is to change the nominal interest rate. Like in the US, it's going to be Fed funds rate. Here it will be учетная ставка, right? And typically, we don't really worry about this object here, but at the ZLB, this is very close to zero, or you just, can't change it for some political or operational reason. So your only hope is to try to massage this object somehow and have a lower real interest rate. So because people expect very high inflation in the future, their perception of the real interest rate is going to be very low, and they will be very, very willing to buy more goods now, invest into infrastructure or some other projects. Okay. Now, what's important in this concept is that the central bank has an ability to manipulate expectations. Somehow you can convince private agents in the economy that this is going to happen. But the key question is, whose agents you can manipulate, whose agents you can regulate, right? One, maybe financial markets. Another possibility, it's professional forecasters. Maybe it's firms or households, right? Which of these agents are actually influenced by the announcements of the central bank? Who is listening to the central bank? That's the key question. And the standard framework for policy analysis in this context is to assume that you have full information rational expectations. Basically, people know what Gontareva was saying or Ben Bernanke is saying, right? They try to catch every word they say. Okay? The central bank is extremely effective at managing this expectation. So if Ben Bernanke said inflation is 2%, from now on, everybody should believe this. Okay? And hopefully, something like this is going to happen in the National Bank of Ukraine. And as a result of this, this notion of forward guidance, that you promise something to happen in the future, is extremely powerful. To the extent that you can say that inflation is going to be 5% 100 years from now, and you should have an immediate effect today. This is what happens in these theoretical models, in this theoretical framework. And this was what motivated this whole policy agenda in the developed world. You want to manage expectations, it's going to be very powerful, you will have an immediate and big impact right away. You don't have to wait a very long time. Now, what we try to do in this paper is basically have an empirical assessment of whether this is going to work in practice, this whole concept. Forward guidance, managing expectations, anchoring inflation expectations. And for this, we use a survey from New Zealand. Specifically, we're going to look at firms. Unfortunately, most of the data which is available to researchers is for professional forecasters, right? So we know their expectations, but very infrequently we know anything about expectations of households or firms, especially for firms. It's really a big problem in this data. Now, what we find in this country, which is going to be New Zealand, is that managers of firms have really strange expectations, right? They rely on all sorts of pieces of information which are not coming from the central bank. For example, they use their personal shopping experience to form a belief about what's going to happen in the future. This is really striking. They should listen to professional forecasters. They should listen to the governor of the central bank in New Zealand. They are not doing that. Also, what strikes us as really remarkable in New Zealand is that managers are very badly informed about the objectives of the central bank, who is the governor of the central bank. And so to the extent you have to rely in your models on this notion of full information rational expectations, when everybody knows everything about the state of the economy, the future course of the economy, this is not going to work here. These guys seem to be very, very unaware of what's happening in the economy. Now, this New Zealand example is not going to be, something outrageous and very kind of spatial. It's going to be a systematic pattern. We have data for the US. We can look at the US, and we're going to find very similar patterns. So it's more like a system. Okay, it's more like a system. Why is this important? Well, it's important because for countries like Ukraine, where inflation is high now, but we try to convince everybody that in 5 years from now, inflation is going to be 5%, it's going to be very stable, it's going to be very low, we have to communicate this somehow to people who are not really following the central bank, right? who don't know who is the governor of the Fed, who don't really know what inflation targeting means. And you know, this stuff here happened for countries which had very successful policy regime for many, many years. New Zealand had inflation targeting for 25 years, and still you have this kind of problems. And so this will create challenges for countries like Ukraine because we don't have established infrastructure, we don't have anchored expectations in the first place, we don't have a history of successful policy making at the central bank. Something has to be, you know, done here, but it's going to be very difficult. This is the basic message of this paper. By the way, so if you have a question, feel free to interrupt us and just raise your hand. Now, why we study New Zealand? There is a prosaic and a sort of fundamental reason why we want to do it. Prosaic reason was because this is where we found funding to do it. The intellectual reason why we want to do this is because New Zealand was the pioneer of inflation targeting. You know, this is now the official target of the central bank in Ukraine, but the first country that actually tried this and showed that it worked was New Zealand, right? Before inflation targeting was adopted, New Zealand was very similar to Ukraine. Very high, very volatile inflation. After that, it became low, much less volatile. And you know, by the time of the survey, we had basically 25 years of experience of very low and stable inflation, right? So if you want to learn something about inflation targeting in this country, everybody should have had an opportunity to observe it working, right? They should have had every chance to learn about it, right? And somehow they actually didn't. Okay. Now, what is the survey? The survey is a random sample of about 3,000 firms from various sectors. You exclude very small firms. Most of them are going to be in agriculture. We feel it's not really a firm, it's more like a household if you have very few employees. It's a survey, so we have to spend a lot of time making sure that the quality of the survey is high. It was a phone interview, but before we call these people, we send them an email and said, hey, you know, something is going to come into your mailbox or somebody is going to call you. You should be prepared. This is kind of questions we're going to ask you. All interviews were recorded, and you know, in real time when you ask questions, you know, somebody was typing in answers, and then another person was listening to the tape recording to make sure that the entries in the first kind of perception of the answers were consistent with what the person was actually saying. The response rate was relatively high, 20-30%. So this was good. Also spent a ton of time making sure that the survey has high quality, because you always worry that when you call somebody and ask for, you know, something, they're going to give you a random answer just to get rid of you, right? So we spend a lot of time making sure that there is a consistency in answers. We ask the same question in several ways, in different ways, in different times, or even in the same survey to make sure that, you know, people understand the question and they give a reasonable answer. Okay. Now, we had this survey done in multiple waves, and this is going to be important because if you have a panel of firms and you track them over time, you can see how their beliefs evolve over time, right? So they may think, you know, something is going to happen now with inflation, but a year later they will have another belief. And we can try to understand why these beliefs have changed. Okay, that's going to be important. Now, the biggest wave was the first one, about 3,000 firms. Then we had a big drop. This was not because firms refused to participate. It was our budget constraint. This is how much we can handle given the money. Then we got more funding and we did more firms. This last survey is going to be the smallest. It's not because, again, we didn't have willingness of firms to participate. It's just the nature of the survey was very different. Here we had, to some extent, mostly multiple choice questions. This survey was more an open-ended interview. When you ask people questions, something like, what do you think the central bank is trying to achieve? And you let them talk and talk and talk and talk. And you know, this can take a lot of time, and so we had to make sure that people have enough opportunities to say whatever they want, which means it was very costly for us to do each of these surveys. But the survey is going to be very important because it will tell us how people think about inflation, how they form their inflation expectations in a kind of very direct and open-ended fashion. Now, we also had lots and lots of questions about expectations about inflation, GDP, unemployment. We had a lot of information about what kind of business these firms run, what kind of efficiency they have, what kind of competition environment they face. Lots and lots of information. This is great because most of the time administrative data is not telling you anything about who is the manager of a firm. Like, does he have a PhD, an economics degree? Did he have any experience of working in another country? How many competitors you have? What is your marginal cost? What is your price? What is the curvature of your marginal cost? So you can ask even this kind of questions with surveys. You can ask hypothetical questions. What would you do if X happens? Again, this is very useful because if you want to estimate a certain structural parameter and elasticity, you don't have to estimate a complicated model. You just ask a person, what would you do in a given situation? And then you have a perfect kind of experiment for estimating this elasticity. Now, so as the first pass of the data, we thought this was going to be, in a way, a very boring paper. Like, New Zealand had inflation targeting for 25 years. We should see, like, perfect example of anchored inflation expectations. We came up with 5 metrics of what anchored expectations should be, how they should look. And the first simple sort of prediction of this anchored inflation expectations was that, if you're really successful in convincing people that inflation is going to be 2%, this is the official target of the central bank in New Zealand, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, then the average belief about inflation should be 2%. Okay, so it's as simple as that. Now, here is some information from the survey and kind of objective data. This is the recent inflation rate in New Zealand. It was very low, very close to the official target of 2%. This was the projection for 1 year ahead inflation from the central bank. They were running below the target for some time for various reasons. New Zealand, similar to Ukraine, is very dependent on commodity prices. This was the time when commodity prices started to fall, and that's why they had this downgrade. When you ask households, they had much higher inflation expectations, right? So it was nowhere close to 2% and clearly much higher than what was projected by the central bank. Firms had even higher inflation expectations, even higher than households. Now, you might think, okay, how this can happen? This guy should be more educated, more financially literate. How come they expect higher inflation than these guys? This is not a sort of a fundamental reason. This is a reflection of the differences in the design of surveys for firms and for households. In this household survey, the way they ask this question is a kind of a two-step procedure. First, they call you and say, do you know what inflation means? And if you say yes, then they tell you, okay, what do you think inflation is going to be? So you have a very select group of people, okay? That's one big difference. Well, here we ask everybody to tell us their inflation expectations. The second big difference here is that they say, if you say inflation is going to be more than 15%, we treat you as crazy and exclude from the survey. If you say inflation is going to be less than minus 2%, we treat you as crazy and we exclude you. Okay? Now, you'll be surprised how many people think that inflation is going to be more than 10, 15, 20% in New Zealand. And so they basically get rid of people who think, inflation is going to be really disastrous. And this is why this mean is kind of towards the low end. If we impose the same filters and restrictions, we can also make these numbers closer. Okay, we didn't do this. But the point here is that, the average belief is much higher than the official target actual numbers of the projection of the central bank. So in this sense, we violate a very simple, but maybe the strongest notion of anchored inflation expectations, that, they deviate from the official target. The second, now you may say, well, this is happening because you're just looking at the short-run inflation expectations. The central bank is just saying that we're going to have 2% on average in the long run. We can ask the same question about what was inflation over the last 10 years. On average, it was 2%, very close to the official target. You ask the central bank, what is going to be the inflation in the next 10 years? 2.1%, again, very close to the official target. You ask households 4%, firms 3%. So even at this level, you're going to fail this very basic test of anchored inflation expectations. Now, you might say, well, maybe firms have, problems with predicting the future, but if you have rational expectations, full information, at least they should understand what was happening in the economy, what was the past inflation, right? And it's extremely easy to get this information. You don't have to think anything. You can just go online, Google inflation in New Zealand, and numbers like this are going to pop up, and you're done, right? You don't have to think hard about that. But when you ask households and firms about what inflation was, they think inflation was much, much higher than actually was happening in New Zealand, right? So again, it's a very striking deviation from this notion of full information rational expectations and anchored expectations. Now, okay, so this doesn't work, but this was the strongest test. Maybe we should, consider a weaker notion of what anchored inflation expectations should be looking like. Maybe what should be true is that, okay, maybe we deviate from the official target, but that's okay because, you can have short-term fluctuations in the economic conditions, and, that's why we're going to deviate from the official target. But everybody should agree on this, because if you have full information rational expectations, there should be no disagreement whatsoever about the future course of inflation or past inflation, okay? Now, this is a very easy test to check. You can just look at the histogram of inflation beliefs in New Zealand. You have 5-year ahead inflation, 1-year ahead inflation. This gives you the mass that integrates to 1. It's true that many people think that inflation is going to be 2%, so in this sense it's good. But then you have this huge tail of people thinking inflation is going to be 5%, 10%, and some people even saying it's 15%. So there is a lot of dispersion. That's inconsistent with anchored inflation expectations, because these guys and these guys, if they deviate from 2, they should agree it's going to be 3. And we don't see anything like this. We see enormous dispersion of beliefs. It's inconsistent with anchored inflation expectations. Now, what is another, again, this is a very strong, relatively strong notion of anchored inflation expectations. Maybe we can consider something simpler. Maybe I think inflation is going to be 3%, and then no matter what the central bank is doing in New Zealand, I'm going to continue to believe in this number because this is my very strong belief. So I should have very strong confidence in my belief. And then you can have situations like this, because some people will never be convinced that you have 5% or 2% inflation. They will always believe stubbornly that it's going to be 5%. Okay? So maybe, the central bank in New Zealand exhausted its capacity to convince people. Just people are so stubborn. But if that's true, then the confidence in their forecast should be really, really high. Really, really high. So if they think it's 3% on average, they should not think that inflation is going to be 5% with some probability or minus 5% with certain probability. It should be very, very concentrated. How you can do this? Well, in the survey, you can ask questions. You can say, okay, here we give you 9 or 10 inflation bins. Okay, inflation maybe between 2 and 4%, between 4 and 6, 6 and 8, and so on. Give us a probability that you assign to each of these outcomes. Okay, and then you have a probability distribution. If you have really anchored inflation expectations, this distribution should be really collapsing, right? So people should really agree that maybe we'll have 5% inflation, but we should never see anything like 25. Now, in contrast, here you see huge uncertainty about the future course of inflation, right? So some people think, 10% inflation is totally plausible, 10-15% inflation is totally plausible. You can have a deflation, that's also a possibility. It seems really striking that people can assign this kind of probabilities to events that never basically happened in New Zealand over the past 25 years. Right? So they had really low inflation. You should not expect 6, 5, or 10% inflation. Another way to do the same, because for each guy we have this probability distribution, we can calculate what is the standard deviation of these beliefs, okay? And then look at the distribution of that. And it's true that, some people are going to have really concentrated beliefs. They will say, okay, inflation is going to be 10% and assign 100 probability to that inflation bit. But lots and lots of people have really dispersed beliefs, right? In this sense, they have very low confidence, very low confidence. Okay, maybe, again, this is a very hard test for people to understand. Maybe we should work with an even weaker notion of what is anchored inflation expectations. Once you can say, okay, maybe, people are totally stupid and disconnected, but at least they should be consistent over time, right? So if I say it's 5, I'm going to say 5 all the time. If this is true, then we should see very small revisions in the beliefs of economic agents about future inflation. And this is where the panel component is important, because we see a guy in one way, we track this person over time, and we can see how his beliefs are changing over time, how he revises his beliefs about future inflation. Now, what you see is really striking. It's true that some people are not revising their beliefs about a third, but the rest, 2/3, have really big revisions in their beliefs. It's not unusual to see a person who is saying, you know, inflation is going to be 0 now and then minus 5% in another wave. Or first they say it's 5% and then go to 0. If you believe that, you know, anchored expectations should be in New Zealand, you should see this distribution really, really concentrated, very, very small dispersion. And instead you see huge variation in the revisions. All right, well, again, so this are strong, relatively strong notions. You may say, okay, let's consider an even weaker notion of anchored inflation expectations. The idea here is that, you know, in the short run, strange things can happen. We can have 3% inflation just because of commodity prices or changes in tariffs. But in the long run, the central bank should have ultimate power over inflation. And if the central bank is saying that inflation should be 2%, the correlation between what happens now and what happens in 10 years from now should be 0. Right? Because whatever happens now, it has no bearing for the future, for 10 years. Inflation in 10 years will be 2% if you're really good at anchoring inflation expectations. Now, we can ask this kind of questions and run a regression where we have one question about what's going to happen with inflation in the next 12 months, 1 year ahead. What will happen in the next 5 to 10 years? The correlation between this is huge, right? 0.6 R squared. The beta is 0.7. So basically, if I think inflation is going to be 10% next year, I will think that inflation will be 10% in 5, 10 years from now. Again, this is totally inconsistent with the notion of anchored inflation expectations. So we have those 5 basic tests of anchored inflation expectations, and none of them works in New Zealand. That's really striking because we had 25 years of very successful inflation targeting, very low inflation, very low volatility. It's a small country. You're more likely to see a governor of the central bank in a supermarket. He may be your neighbor. You should know about inflation targeting. And you don't see this here. Okay. Now, the rest of the paper is going to be, okay, why we have this, how this could happen, and what this means for economists from a positive and normative perspective. Okay, so maybe just managers don't care about inflation because it's so low in New Zealand. Maybe they just checked out and don't pay attention to inflation data. That's a possibility. Maybe they don't understand the concept of inflation, so that's why we have this huge dispersion in the beliefs. Because, you know, they mean different things when they talk about inflation. Maybe they think there is some sort of conspiracy theory that inflation is really high, but the statistical office like Держкомстат is cooking numbers and they always say it's 2%, or like in Argentina where it's obviously happening. Maybe managers don't know what the central bank is doing, and that's why they have this crazy belief. So the central bank should be working harder to convince people that this is the official target, this is the objective, this is what's going to happen, this is how we operate. Maybe this is the reason. Maybe they know about the targets, but they don't find these targets credible. They say, okay, they promised 2%, but we don't think it's going to happen. Maybe this is what's going to happen. Maybe they don't get the right inputs. People are not crazy, they are not stupid, but they get their information from strange sources or incomplete sources, and that's why they end up with these crazy beliefs about future inflation. Okay, that's in the rest of this talk, I'm going to basically try to look at all of the theories and say, you know, which of them is true or has support in the data and which one clearly is not true. The first question is, do people care about inflation? There is some support for this idea, right? So we ask firms, how much would you be willing to pay for a professional forecast? And they say $140. It doesn't seem much, but on the other hand, you know, if you know the official target is 2% and you always had 2% for the last 25 years, it's a very simple business model how we can make money, right? You establish a professional forecast, you charge these firms $140, you send it to 3,000 firms, it's serious money. Right, somehow it's not happening. We'll also ask firms, you know, what would you do? It's a hypothetical question. That's the power of the survey. What would you do if inflation turns out to be higher than you expected? Would you change your wages, prices? Would you change your employment or change your investment plans? 75% of firms said they will do something, at least along one of these margins. So they care about inflation, at least to some extent. It's not like they're completely oblivious to inflation. Okay, they should care about that. Now, the next question, do I understand the term of inflation? This is where we have to use this open-ended questions when we say this question, and then they can say whatever they want. And then we had a great research assistant who went over these responses and graded them. Right? So we're very good as professors at grading people. Somebody sat down and said, okay, that's the correct answer. I'm going to give you 2 points. If you have a partially correct, I'm going to give you partial credit. I'll give you 1 point. If your answer is still incorrect, I give you 0. 84% correctly defined firms got the maximum grade. Another 10% got partial credit. So they knew its general level of prices, so they knew it's a change. Only very few managers did not understand inflation. They had some crazy notion. So these people know what inflation is. It's not an explanation. Do you think official data is credible? Almost 90% of firms said yes. So it's not because they don't think the statistical office is cooking numbers, right? They believe the official data. It makes sense to them. Okay, so if you have this very different levels of perception and none of this is true, where are these differences are coming from? Okay. Now, one way to approach this problem is to start with a very basic definition of inflation. What's inflation at the aggregate level? That's inflation for specific product categories like milk, housing, I don't know, cars, gasoline, and then weights that go from the consumption baskets of these households or managers, right? And then you add up these numbers. It's going to be a weighted average. And then the reason why you can have crazy responses about this object is because you have crazy responses about this object or crazy responses about this object, or maybe some correlation between this craziness or this and this. Now, what did we do here? Well, we had a series of questions where we basically said, here you have 7 categories of goods. Tell us what was the inflation for each of those goods and how much weight the official CPI in New Zealand assigns to these weights. Okay. Now here's what we got. So housing prices. Okay, so that's the first object here. People saw that 20% of CPI in New Zealand is purchases of new houses. Okay, the official number is 4%. People thought, that housing prices play a much more important role in New Zealand than, in fact, is true in the data. Stock prices, 8%. In practice, it's 0. Stock prices never go into the CPI. Okay, gasoline prices, basically the price you pay when you fuel your car, right? 20%, 5%. Okay, so they think 20% of CPI is just gas. That's crazy. Car prices, again, they think new cars are much more important for CPI than is true. Cost of rent is approximately correct. Healthcare, more important. The only kind of negative number here is when they saw that food prices account for 10%, in practice it's 20%. Okay, so you see these big differences, and this may be one of the reasons why they expect higher inflation, because inflation could have been a lot higher here than in anything else. Or, for example, here in stock prices, maybe they had a boom in stock prices, and so the general level of prices is rising because stock prices are rising. Okay, that's one answer. Another thing which is striking here, you see this is standard deviations of responses across people. And these numbers are very big, which means there is a lot of disagreement across households about what weight is assigned into the CPI. And most likely it's reflected in the types of goods these households buy. If I buy a lot of housing, I'm going to think, housing is a very important component of the CPI. If I don't buy housing, I don't think it's going to be important, something like this. And so when you have dispersion of beliefs about inflation, in part it's because people assign very different weights to what goes into the CPI. That's one thing. When you ask firms to report inflation for these specific categories, they actually do relatively okay. For example, for gasoline prices, they said inflation was -6%. The actual number was -7%. It's not as crazy as this difference. And also the standard deviation tends to be smaller. So the idea here in these results is that people, if you ask them about specific goods, have a good idea about what was happening with prices. When you start to ask them to aggregate this across goods, categories, and so on, this is where the confusion is going to show up. This is where we start to see problems. Okay. Now, we can do this a little bit more formally when we say, okay, so this is the perceived inflation, this is the actual inflation. why we see these differences. One source of difference is going to be coming from the fact that we just think, for a specific product category, the perceived inflation is higher than the actual number. Okay, so if you think that inflation is rising for all goods for 5%, when in fact it's only 2%, this number will be positive, and as well as it's just, people have their own idea about the general level of prices. Okay, it's not about weights, it's just, from a consistent bias in the responses. Another possibility is that people assign higher weights to goods where inflation was higher. So if the gas prices are going up and they think inflation is going to be, the weight to that is going to be 20% instead of 5%, you're going to overestimate inflation at the general level. And final term is, some correlation between these two. Okay. Now, when you do this decomposition, you will find that this is the average error, this is the degree of dispersion, it's very high. In terms of levels, a lot of coming from the fact that people think inflation was higher in general than the actual numbers. If you want to understand this number, this dispersion, it's mostly coming from differences in weights. This difference here, that people think weights to, say, gas prices are much higher than actually was, and there is a lot of disagreement about how much this weight is across consumers. Okay. Now, if you have those huge differences in these weights, why people have this belief that, somebody may say 50% of CPI is determined by gas prices, and somebody may say it's 0. Why do they have these differences in beliefs? Okay. Now, to answer this question, we have to, again, go to the managers and ask them open-ended questions. How do you typically form your inflation expectations? How do you arrive at these numbers? Okay. Now, again, this was a long list of kind of laundry list of, what can happen, and we had somebody to sit down and read through these answers and give us, a few categories so that we can aggregate and have some pattern in this. And typically, you can assign these responses, the sources, or kind of the ways of forming these expectations in 4 broad categories. One would be they read newspapers, watch TV, and that's how they form their inflation expectations. Maybe meeting your colleagues, counterparties in other firms, suppliers, something like this. Shopping experience, basically, I go buy stuff in the supermarket that gives me an idea about prices. Or maybe I just look at what happens with prices of competitors and suppliers. If they raise their prices, I think inflation is high, something along these lines. Now, the media is going to be very important. Half of the people use media to form their inflation expectations. They listen to radio, they watch TV, they read newspapers. They tend to have relatively okay forecasts and backcasts. Remember, the official target is 2%. The unconditional average is much higher. What's striking is that half of the people use shopping experience to form their inflation expectations, right? So if I buy a lot of gas, I will think that CPI is going to be assigning a big weight to gas prices. Okay, if I buy lots of imported goods and exchange rate is changing, I'm going to say, aha, it's all about exchange rate, and I may assign some price and weight to that as well. Okay. Now, we had more questions about, how people form their inflation expectations when we give them multiple choice questions. Basically, we ask them, tell us what source of information is important for you. 88% of people said that personal shopping experience is extremely informative for their inflation expectations. That's really striking because what you buy is not really important for your market most of the time, right? You should not use your personal experience to form inflation expectations. 76% look at gas prices. Again, that's huge because, gas is only 5% of the consumption basket. You should not look at that number as an indicator of inflation, really, but, 76% of managers do that. Only 20% of firms use professional forecasts. Okay, it's really striking. People just don't want to get information from these guys. It's surprising to us. Now, it seems like shopping experience is a very important part of inflation expectations formation process. But another story may be that the central bank in New Zealand does not have credibility. Or maybe the central bank is just not very good at communicating their messages to the general public. Now, what can we do here? We can ask a series of questions. We ask a very simple question. Can the central bank in New Zealand control inflation in the next 5-10 years? almost 100% said yes. Okay, that's the correct answer, right? So if you have inflation targeting and the central bank is really capable of achieving this target, it should be 100. Over the next 12 months, the answer should be maybe 50-50, maybe less, because in the very short run, the central bank cannot really affect inflation. It's kind of gradual, slow-moving process. Yet, we find almost 100% of people said the central bank can control inflation even in this very short horizon. So, the central bank should not be able to do this, but I think they can. So it sounds like the credibility is not a problem. People in New Zealand really believe in this institution. They think, they will be able to manage inflation, and yet somehow they end up with this crazy, very high dispersed inflation expectations. Now, so then we started to think, okay, so maybe we should just check, if they know what the central bank is trying to achieve. And we had 3 basic questions about that. Okay, so the first question was, what is the main objective of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand? And we gave them some options: keep exchange rate, promote full employment, keep interest rates low and stable, keep inflation low and stable, help the government to finance its spending. The correct answer is this. You should also understand that we cannot tell them inflation targeting because they probably don't know what this means, right? You have to frame a question in a way that, it's understandable to people. Now, what was the response rate? The correct answer was picked by 30% of people. It seems really, really low given that they had this regime for 25 years, and whenever you listen to what these central bankers are saying in New Zealand, they kept saying inflation will be low and stable, low and stable, low and stable, and yet only a third of people know about this. Another way to get a quantitative sort of perspective on this is a multiple choice question, right? If you pick your answers at random, right, this number should be 20%. So it sounds like 30% know about this, but if you compare it to 20%, it means the treatment effect of the central bank was only 10%. It's very, very low, very unsuccessful to this extent. Then we said, okay, maybe it's a very abstract concept, maybe we should ask something more basic. We said, okay, who is the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand? Okay, we gave them 5 options. I don't know. This is the current guy. This is the guy who was the governor of the bank 2 years before the survey. He stepped down, and this was replaced by this person. Being English, the Minister of Finance. This was a totally random person. He is a soccer teammate of our co-author in New Zealand. He knows nothing about monetary policy. So we just wanted to have somebody totally unrelated, and we found this guy. Now, what was the response rate? Only 30% of people knew that the current governor is this guy, Wheeler. 40% continued to believe that the guy who left the office 2 years ago is still the governor, right? It was really striking to us. After 2 years, they still thought he's the guy. 20% of people thought it's Minister of Finance. This guy was very happy, Charles Coley, that 10% of people think he is the governor. Actually, we were surprised that, so few people didn't choose this option, right? If you don't know, you just say, I don't know, but somehow they felt like, okay, one of these guys have to be. Anyway, so that was really striking to us. Then we said, okay, so suppose we ask them the following question. Okay, so if the central bank is trying to achieve some level of inflation, what kind of level of inflation you think it's targeting, trying to achieve, right? And we gave them a bunch of numbers, 1, 2, 3, and they basically had to pick one of these. 12% of people picked the right number, 2%. Now, the mandate of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is saying it's 2% plus minus 1%. So maybe, this is not a crazy number, this is not a crazy number. If you add up this, you get 40% or something like this. But the rest, 60%. So inflation is much higher. I mean, the target of inflation of the central bank is much higher. This was really surprising to us because, you should not see these numbers here. You should see, something in here. So when you look at this, only 10% of firms, of managers, correctly answered 3 questions, right? The rest, 90% had at least one mistake. Most firms had multiple mistakes. The guys who answered questions correctly, they have very good forecasts. Like, they knew it's the target. The average was 2%. It was very concentrated around the official target. The guys who had at least one mistake, they had a much higher inflation forecast. They had a lot more dispersion. So in this sense, it was really, really striking that, you have this group of very informed people and then basically people who have no clue, okay, about inflation. So it seems like, there is a problem here. Now, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, they take great pride in their communication strategy. Right? They say, well, we use Facebook, we use Twitter, we use email subscription to communicate our messages. And we felt like, okay, so given what we know about, what people know about the central bank, how do they hear about the central bank? What kind of sources of information, media, is important for their inflation expectations? We had newspapers, TV, monetary report, RSS subscription, Twitter, email, treasury report, monetary report. This was probably the most important part for the NBU. And we asked these people to give us a grade for each of this source of information. If it's an extremely important, you give 6. If it's totally irrelevant, you give 1. Then you calculate average across people. And here, then, we look at the distribution of these responses as a function of what they think the target of the central bank is. Now, oops. So if it's 2%, many people read the report. They read even treasury reports. They follow media and newspapers, so that's good. But as you go in this direction, very few people start to read the report. Most people don't know what it is. They don't look at the treasury. They don't look at inflation kind of type of information in the standard media. But what was striking is that all this new media, Twitter, Facebook, they basically have no bearing whatsoever for these people. They don't care. So it's as if it goes to outer space and it has no effect whatsoever. So if the central bank in Ukraine is trying to communicate to the public, it should expect that all this new media are going to have zero impact on inflation expectations. Okay. Now, we try to understand also, maybe there is some fundamental reason why people don't pay attention to inflation. Maybe it's a function of the degree of competition, the level of education of the manager, the slope of the profit function, some sort of incentive effect. And we show in the paper that you can run these regressions and you'll find some explanation. But the R-square in these regressions is very small. Lots of things are not explained. But it's not just junk and noise, right? So there is something going on here. You can have fundamental forces which determine the desire of people, their incentives to collect and process information, to know something about inflation expectations. Okay. Now, is New Zealand crazy in this? Okay. Maybe it's somebody said it's a country of hobbit, they don't understand the same, so we should not be surprised. Well, what we did in the rest of this paper, we said, okay, we're going to look at the US, a very big country which had some form of inflation targeting for a long time. The official target started recently, but de facto it was going on for a long time. And maybe, we can try to look for, similar patterns, do similar tests on the US data and see if there is something similar there, okay? Now, there is no firm survey in the US, but you have big surveys of households. There is the Michigan Survey of Consumers and Survey of Consumer Expectations. This is run by the New York Fed. This is run by my home institution, University of Michigan. And in addition to this, we'll use a lot of polling data. Like, when somebody calls Pew Research or Gallup and say, what do you think is going to happen? Or what do you think about the president? Or what do you think about the Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke? This kind of data. Okay. Now, first 2 tests, right? The average expectation should be close to the official target, 2%, very little dispersion. Now, this is the official data in for CPI, okay? Very low, 2%. There was a big drop because gas prices fell in this quarter. But on average, it's kind of close to 2%. This is 1 year ahead projection from the Fed. Very close to 2%. 10 years from now, 5 years from now, they always say it's 2%. It's not, I don't think it's a forecast. They just say it's going to be 2%. You ask professional forecasters, almost invariably 2%. Almost invariably 2%. Very little disagreement. These beliefs are extremely concentrated. They all think it's going to be 2% more or less. You talk to households, they have much, much, much higher inflation expectations. In the short run, in the long run, a huge degree of disagreement, very similar to what we saw in New Zealand. If you don't believe the Michigan survey, you say, these guys in academia don't know what they do. You talk to people at the Fed who took it seriously, spent millions of dollars to make it working. They also have very high inflation expectations and a huge dispersion of beliefs. So it's not just Michigan guys. It seems like it's a general pattern. It's a very robust result. And if so, these first 2 tests go away. Okay, we failed. Very similar to New Zealand. All right, now you may say, well, maybe these guys don't know what the official target is and so on, what was the history. It's true that, over time, these inflation beliefs were kind of moving closer to each other. You may say, well, maybe you have one crazy guy who is saying inflation is going to be 1,000%, and you should look at the median. You look at the median and you get very similar results. Somebody said, well, it's okay because, these guys have very stable average, right? So they continue to believe 4% all the time. Now, to answer this, you can just look at kind of magnify this more recent data and see how averages and medians were evolving over time. And you see, again, big variation. In the mean, you can have like 7% in one of the months or quarters. In another one, you have something a lot less than 2%. You see a lot of variability. If you have anchored inflation expectations, you should see like a flat line, nothing moving, or very little variation. You don't see anything like this. Okay? That's a problem. Now, about confidence in their forecasts. Again, in the New York survey, they asked people to assign probabilities to different inflation buckets. What do you think the probability inflation will be between 0 and 2%, 2 to 4, 4 to 8? It's true that many people think it's going to be about 2%, but then you have this huge tail of people thinking you will have a massive deflation in the U.S., and then a mass of people thinking inflation will be like 4, 10, more percent. It seems totally crazy. This has never happened in the U.S. over the last 25 years or so. This will almost never happen. It's something like this happened in the Great Depression, but it was like, so long time ago. And this was the time of gold standard. Now we print money. You should never see anything like this. Okay? Same with the dispersion of beliefs across people, right? For each guy, we can calculate how much uncertainty you have and look at these people. Lots and lots of disagreement. A lack of confidence in their forecasts. In fact, this means are much higher than what you see in New Zealand. That's really striking. So we failed the third test too. Then we say, okay, let's look at the changes in the forecasts, how much they revise their forecasts. This is for Michigan survey, very similar to what we saw in New Zealand, very big dispersion. Plus minus 5% is totally typical. When you look at the professional forecasters, this is how anchored inflation expectations should look like. You see this whole distribution is extremely compressed. Here you have an order of magnitude more dispersion, right? So maybe you anchor these guys, but you totally don't anchor these guys. Okay? Now, another test, what's the correlation between long-term inflation forecast and short-term inflation forecast? The theory tells us that this correlation should be 0. You run this on a survey of consumer expectations in the US, and you see numbers which are very, very similar to what we saw in New Zealand. This coefficient is between 0.6 and 1, extremely high correlation. In fact, it should be very close to 0, as I said. So we failed that one too. Now, about media. We don't have questions about the importance of media in this US surveys, but we can get some indirect information about the importance of media and how people form inflation expectations. What do they know about monetary policy? And what we did here, we said, okay, a series of polls were asking people, tell us who is the governor, the chairman of the Fed, right? And again, you had the multiple choice question. We had this from different surveys. Roughly a third of people knew who Ben Bernanke was. A little higher here in the middle of the crisis, then again a lot lower. When Janet Yellen was appointed, only a quarter of people heard of her. Only half of people ever heard of her. And only a quarter picked the right answer. And the similar results here. In fact, in his new book, Ben Bernanke has a story when his daughter went to college after he was appointed to be the chair of the Fed. And this daughter had a roommate, and this roommate was asking her, what is your dad doing? And she said, well, my father is the chair of the Fed. And this roommate said, oh my God, your father is Alan Greenspan. And in fact, I don't show it here, but the second most popular person in this responses is Alan Greenspan. Right? And so after many years, after he stepped down, many people continue to believe that he runs the Fed, which is really striking. There is another story. Alan Blinder, who was the governor of the Fed, he was very ambitious about communication and trying to convince people it's working, we should be more transparent. And a guy who was there for many years, he said, we should be more careful, we should understand the limits of what people know about the Fed. And he told Alan Blinder that many people think that Federal Reserve System is a system of national parks. They manage forest. It's not a financial institution. I think it's true. If you talk to a typical person in the US, they don't know what the Fed is, really. Anyway, so then another thing we did, we said, okay, so let's see, how people follow social media. Maybe this is how they get their information in the US. Now, the Federal Reserve System has a bunch of regional banks, and then you have Federal Reserve Board. If you add up likes on Facebook for these guys, you have 20,000 people. It's not a lot, actually. I was a little surprised by how small it is. And it has about 700,000 followers on Twitter. Now, US is a much bigger country, right, than Ukraine or New Zealand. Maybe this is, okay or not okay. To put this in perspective, we calculated similar Facebook likes and Twitter followers. FBI has many more likes, many more followers. CIA, okay, so if you may say, okay, they care about something domestic, that's why FBI is so important. CIA has zero bearing on the lives of people in the US. They have many more likes, about the same number of followers, okay? Paul Krugman, he has twice as many followers, right? So he is much more effective at communicating than the Fed. The whole Fed, right? Thousands of people. Now, these two guys are saying basically kill the Fed, stop the Fed, get rid of the Fed. They have many more likes and about the same number of followers. Right? So if the Fed is trying to communicate something to the public, these guys have no idea. Okay. Now, here is another way to get this message, okay? So there is a strong research agenda in computer science and in social sciences. When you can look at frequencies or intensity of searches, it tells us something about what people care about, okay? So if people search intensively for flu or exchange rate, this is high on their agenda. Now, what we did here, we said, okay, let's pick, a list of macro variables like unemployment, GDP, inflation, and, construct time series for searches for those keywords. Okay, and then pick a word which is completely unrelated to anything economic, like puppies, maybe kittens, it doesn't matter. What's striking here is that first, this line is really flat. Okay, so even in the middle of the crisis, people didn't search for unemployment, GDP, or inflation, so it was kind of completely unrelated to their lives. For puppies, you had an upward trend. I don't know if it's demographics or what, but that was really striking that the level of attention people allocate to macroeconomic variables, the Fed, is extremely low. So if the Fed is trying to manipulate these expectations, people are not listening. They don't care. This is the limit of the forward guidance. You try to convince somebody that you will do something in the future and you see no reaction. It's not because people are not believing you, it's just they don't listen to you. That was really striking to us.